What do you do when your wife claims she's pregnant with your brother's baby and demands you hand over your house? So you sell it in secret, let them pack their bags and try to move in, then watch from across the street with a fresh cup of coffee as the new owner calls the police on them? My name is Daniel Foster, and I have spent the last 12 years building a career in residential real estate, which means I understand property law, title transfers, escrow timelines, and the cold mechanical process of turning a home into a transaction. And I learned a long time ago that the difference between winning and losing in this business is not passion or charisma, but documentation, patience, and the ability to keep your face neutral when someone is lying directly to you. I am 38 years old, married for 6 years to a woman named Lauren, who works in marketing and has always been good at presenting polished narratives to the world. And I have a younger brother named Kyle, who is 32, and has spent most of his adult life drifting between freelance contractor jobs and half-finished business ventures. Always charming, always broke, always showing up at family gatherings with a new plan that never quite materializes into anything resembling stability. I own a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with mature trees and decent schools, the kind of place that young families save for years to afford, and I bought it 7 years ago before I met Lauren, which means the title is in my name alone, a detail that seemed irrelevant at the time but would later become the fulcrum on which everything turned. It was a Thursday evening in late September when I came home early from a property showing that had been canceled at the last minute, and I walked into the house expecting to find it empty because Lauren had told me that morning she would be working late on a campaign presentation. But when I stepped inside, I noticed that her car was in the driveway and the lights were on in the upstairs bathroom, and I called out her name and got no response. So I walked upstairs and found the bathroom door open and a white plastic pregnancy test sitting on the counter beside the sink, the kind with the pink plus sign in the little window, and I stood there for a long moment staring at it because Lauren and I had not been trying to have a child. We had not even discussed it seriously in the last year, and the last time we had been intimate was more than 2 months ago, a fact that I had noticed but had not wanted to examine too closely because I had been busy with work, and she had been distant in a way that felt like stress rather than crisis. I picked up the test carefully, and I took out my phone and I placed the test on the counter beside today's newspaper, the front page showing the date clearly, and I photographed it from 2 angles, making sure the date and the test result were both visible, and I uploaded the images immediately to my secure cloud storage, because I have learned from years of real estate disputes that the first rule of any conflict is to document everything before anyone has a chance to rewrite the story. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and I set the test back down exactly where I had found it, and Lauren appeared in the doorway looking startled, and she asked me what I was doing home so early, and I told her the showing had been canceled, and I asked her if there was something she wanted to tell me, and she looked at the test and her face went pale, and she sat down on the edge of the bathtub and put her hands over her face. And I waited, because I have learned that silence is often more effective than questions when you are trying to get someone to tell the truth. She said she had been meaning to talk to me, but she did not know how to start, and I asked her how far along she was, and she said about 3 months, maybe a little more. And I did the math in my head, and I knew immediately that the timeline did not match our last time together. And I asked her if she was sure about the dates, and she nodded without looking at me. And I asked her if there was anything else she needed to tell me, and she started crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from relief or fear, but the kind that comes from guilt. And she said that the baby was not mine, that she had been seeing someone else, and I asked her who, and she said it was Kyle, my brother, and that they had been together since the spring, and that she was sorry, and that she knew it was wrong, but that it had just happened, and I stood there listening to her use the passive voice as though the affair were something that had occurred independently of her choices, and I felt a strange, cold clarity, the same feeling I get when I am reviewing a contract and I spot a clause that changes everything. I asked her if Kyle knew about the pregnancy, and she said yes, and I asked her what they planned to do, and she said that they wanted to keep the baby, that they wanted to raise it together, and I asked her where they planned to do that, and she said here, in this house, because it was big enough and because Kyle thought it was the right thing for me to move out and let them have the space, and I asked her if Kyle had actually said that, and she nodded, and I asked her if she understood that the house was in my name alone, and she said yes, but that Kyle thought I would do the right thing and sign over my half of the equity because it was for the baby, and I realized in that moment that my brother had not only been sleeping with my wife, but had also been coaching her on how to leverage guilt and family obligation to take my property. And I felt something shift inside me, not anger exactly, but a cold, strategic focus. The same focus I use when I am negotiating a deal, and I realize the other side has underestimated me. I told Lauren that I needed some time to think, and she asked me if I was angry, and I said no, which was true, because anger is a distraction, and I needed to think clearly, and I told her that I would figure out the logistics and that we would talk more later, and she looked relieved, as though she had expected me to yell or throw things or do something that would give her permission to reframe the situation as my fault. But I did not give her that. I just walked downstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I opened my laptop, and I pulled up the property deed, and I confirmed what I already knew, which was that the house was titled solely in my name, purchased 2 years before I met Lauren, which meant that under state law I could sell it without her signature or consent, and I began to formulate a plan. Not out of revenge, but out of a simple recognition that if my wife and my brother believed they could manipulate me into giving up my home, then they had made a fundamental miscalculation, and I was going to use their assumption of my compliance against them. I opened a new document on my laptop, and I created a simple ledger with 3 columns labeled Date, Evidence, and Notes, and I entered the first line, September 23rd, pregnancy test photographed with date-stamped newspaper, wife admits affair with brother Kyle, claims 3 months pregnant, timeline does not match last intimacy, and I saved the document with a password, and I backed it up to 3 separate cloud accounts. Because I knew that once I started this process, there would be no room for missing documentation or lost files. And I needed to build a case that was airtight and unemotional, the kind of case that would survive scrutiny from family, from lawyers, from anyone who tried to rewrite what was about to happen. I heard Lauren moving around upstairs, and I heard the shower start, and I knew that she was probably calling Kyle right now to tell him that I had found the test and that I had not reacted the way they expected, and I wondered how long they had been planning this, how many conversations they had had about the house and the equity and the convenient fiction that I would simply step aside because it was the right thing to do for a child that was not mine. I checked my work calendar, and I saw that I had a site inspection scheduled for the next morning, and I decided that I would go to Kyle's apartment after that, because I needed to hear his version of the story directly, and I needed to document his own words, his own demands, his own assumption that I would cooperate, because I knew that if this ever became a legal matter or a family dispute, the most powerful evidence would be their own voices, their own admissions, their own casual certainty that they had already won. I closed my laptop, and I went to the kitchen, and I made myself a sandwich, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to do something normal, something that would signal to Lauren that I was not falling apart, that I was not going to make this easy for her by collapsing into grief or rage. And when she came downstairs 20 minutes later with wet hair and red eyes, I was sitting at the table eating calmly, and she asked me if I wanted to talk. And I said not tonight, that I needed to process everything, and she said she understood, and she asked me if I was going to tell anyone, and I said no, not yet. And I could see the relief in her face, because she thought that meant I was going to keep this private, that I was going to protect her reputation, but what I really meant was that I was not going to tell anyone until I had a complete strategy, until I had locked down every detail, until there was no way for them to escape the consequences of what they had done. I went upstairs, and I gathered some clothes and my toiletries, and I told Lauren that I was going to stay in a hotel for a few nights while I figured things out. And she asked me if I was leaving her, and I said I did not know yet, which was technically true, because I had not yet decided whether to file for divorce before or after the house sale. And she started crying again, and she said she was sorry. And I told her that sorry was not a plan, and that if she and Kyle wanted to raise a baby, then they needed to think about where they were going to live and how they were going to support a child, and she said that was why they needed the house. And I said I would think about it. And I picked up my bag, and I walked out the door, and I drove to a budget hotel near the highway, and I checked in under my own name because I was not hiding, I was simply creating space to execute a plan, and I sat on the edge of the bed in that anonymous room with the ugly floral bedspread and the bolted television. And I opened my phone and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Paul Mendez, an escrow officer I had worked with for years, a man who understood that real estate transactions could be executed quickly and quietly if you had the right buyer and the right motivation. And I sent him a text message asking if he had time to meet tomorrow afternoon, and he replied within 5 minutes saying yes, and I set my phone down, and I lay back on the bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I realized that I felt calmer than I had in months, because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly how this was going to end. The next morning, I woke up at 6, showered in the small hotel bathroom with the weak water pressure and the plastic-wrapped soap, and I dressed in the same clothes I wear to every property inspection, dark jeans and a button-down shirt that projects competence without formality, because in real estate your appearance is part of the transaction, and people need to trust you before they will sign anything or tell you the truth. I drove to the site inspection, a duplex on the east side of town where the seller was trying to offload a property with foundation issues, and I walked through the rooms with my clipboard and my phone camera, documenting cracks in the drywall and water stains on the ceiling, and I filed my report with the buyer's agent by 9:30, and then I got back in my car and I drove across town to the apartment complex where my brother Kyle had been living for the past 8 months, ever since he moved back to the city after his last business venture collapsed in another state. Kyle's apartment was in a converted industrial building with exposed brick and high ceilings, the kind of place that markets itself as urban and creative, but is really just poorly insulated and overpriced. And I parked in the visitor lot, and I walked up 2 flights of stairs, and I knocked on his door, and I heard footsteps, and then the door opened, and Kyle stood there in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, looking surprised to see me. And he said my name like a question, and I said I wanted to talk to him about Lauren, and he stepped back and gestured for me to come in, and I noticed that his face did not show guilt or shame, but something closer to relief, as though he had been waiting for this conversation and was glad it was finally happening. The apartment was cluttered with tools and half-assembled furniture, evidence of projects started and abandoned, and there were beer bottles on the kitchen counter and a stack of unopened mail on the table, and Kyle offered me coffee and I said no, and he shrugged and poured himself a cup, and he leaned against the counter and he said he guessed Lauren had told me, and I said yes. She told me about the pregnancy, and I asked him if it was true, and he said yes, it was true, and he said he knew it was a complicated situation, but that these things happen. And I noticed the way he phrased it, these things happen, as though the affair were a weather event or a traffic accident rather than a series of deliberate choices that he and my wife had made over a period of months. I asked him how long it had been going on, and he said since April, maybe early May, he was not exactly sure, and I asked him how it started, and he said they had run into each other at a coffee shop near Lauren's office, and they had started talking, and one thing led to another, and I let him use those vague euphemisms because I was not here to shame him or to process my feelings. I was here to document his version of events and to hear him say out loud what he wanted from me. I asked him what he planned to do now, and he said that he and Lauren wanted to keep the baby, that they wanted to be together, and I asked him where they planned to live, and he said they had talked about it, and they thought the house made the most sense, because it was big enough for a family and because it was already set up, and I asked him what he meant by that, and he said that he thought I should move out, that it would be better for everyone if I gave them the space, and I asked him if he expected me to just walk away from the house I bought, and he said he knew it was my house technically, but that he hoped I would do the right thing and let them have it, or at least sign over half the equity so they could refinance and buy me out. I asked him if he had any money to buy me out, and he looked uncomfortable, and he said not right now, but that he was working on some projects, and he expected to have income soon, and I asked him what projects, and he said he was lining up some contractor work, and he had a lead on a property management gig. And I knew from the vague way he described it that none of these projects were real, that he was still doing what he had always done, which was talking about opportunities without ever converting them into actual income, and I realized that his plan was not to buy me out at all. His plan was to guilt me into signing over the house and then to live there rent-free while I paid for a new place. And the audacity of it was almost impressive, except that it confirmed what I already suspected, which was that Kyle had always resented my stability, my income, my ability to plan and execute, and he saw this affair not as a relationship, but as an opportunity to take something that I had built. I asked him if he had talked to a lawyer about any of this, and he said no, they did not need lawyers, it was a family matter, and they could work it out like adults. And I asked him what working it out like adults meant, and he said it meant me being reasonable and recognizing that a kid needed a stable home, and that I was in a better position to start over than they were. And I could hear the script in his voice, the phrases that he had probably rehearsed with Lauren, the framing that made me the selfish one if I refused to cooperate, and I took out my phone and I opened the voice memo app and I set it on the counter between us. And I asked him to repeat what he had just said, about me moving out and signing over the equity, and he looked at the phone and he said he did not want to be recorded. And I said that was fine, but that I wanted to make sure I understood his position correctly, because this was a big decision and I needed to think about it carefully. And he relaxed a little and he said, yeah, he just thought it was the right thing, that the baby deserved a home, and that I would be okay, because I made good money and I could find another place. And I nodded, and I picked up my phone, and I stopped the recording, and I saw that I had captured 2 minutes and 18 seconds of him explaining why I should give up my house. I told Kyle that I needed some time to think about it, and he said he understood, but that Lauren was already 3 months along, and they needed to make plans, and I asked him when they wanted me to move out, and he said by the end of the month if possible, sooner if I could manage it. And I said I would work on the logistics, and he looked relieved again, and he walked me to the door, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, he knew this was hard, but that he appreciated me being cool about it. And I looked at him and I said I was not being cool about it, I was being thoughtful, and there was a difference, and he did not seem to understand the distinction. And I left the apartment and I walked down the stairs and I sat in my car for a few minutes and I played back the recording to make sure the audio was clear, and it was. I could hear every word, every assumption, every casual demand, and I uploaded the file to my cloud storage and I added a new line to my evidence ledger. September 24th, brother confirms affair, admits no money for buyout, demands I move out by end of month, expects equity transfer based on guilt, and I saved the file and I started the car. I drove to Paul Mendez's office, which was in a small professional building near the courthouse, and Paul was a man in his mid-50s with gray hair and reading glasses that he wore on a chain around his neck, and he had been working in escrow and title for 30 years, and he had seen every kind of property dispute and every kind of family drama, and he did not ask unnecessary questions, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I sat down across from his desk, and I told him I needed to sell my house quickly and quietly, and he asked me how quickly, and I said within 2 weeks if possible, and he asked me if there were any complications, any liens or encumbrances or co-owners, and I said no, the title was in my name alone, purchased before my marriage, no liens, no mortgage. And he nodded, and he said that a clean title made things easier, and he asked me if I had a buyer in mind, and I said no. But I needed someone who could close fast, someone with cash who would not need financing or inspections or contingencies. And he leaned back in his chair, and he said he might have someone, a woman named Irene Caldwell, who had just sold her condo and was looking for a single-family home, and she had cash, and she wanted to move quickly because her lease was ending. Paul called Irene while I was sitting there, and he put the phone on speaker. And he told her he had a property that might interest her. A 3-bedroom house in a good neighborhood, clean title, owner motivated to sell, and Irene asked how motivated, and Paul looked at me, and I said I would accept a fair offer, and I could close in 7 days, and Irene said she wanted to see it, and Paul scheduled a walkthrough for the next afternoon, and after he hung up, he asked me if I was sure about this, if I understood that selling a house in 7 days meant leaving money on the table, and I said I understood, but that speed was more important than price. And he said he would draw up the paperwork and have everything ready pending Irene's approval, and I thanked him, and I left his office, and I sat in my car in the parking lot, and I called the hotel, and I extended my reservation for another week, and then I sent a text message to Lauren saying that I was still processing everything, and that I needed a little more time before we talked again, and she replied immediately asking if I was okay, and I said yes, I was fine, I just needed space, and she said she understood, and I could feel her relief even through the text, because she thought that my silence meant acceptance, that I was moving through the stages of grief and would eventually arrive at resignation, but what she did not understand was that I was not grieving, I was planning. The next afternoon I met Irene Caldwell at the house, and I had timed the walkthrough for 2 o'clock because I knew Lauren would be at work, and there would be no risk of an awkward encounter that might raise questions or delay the sale. Irene arrived in a practical sedan, and she was a woman in her late 40s with short gray hair and the efficient demeanor of someone who had worked in healthcare for decades. And she told me as we walked up the driveway that she was a nurse at the county hospital and that she had just finalized her divorce and sold the condo she had shared with her ex-husband, and she wanted a fresh start in a place that had no memories attached to it. I unlocked the front door, and I let her walk through the rooms at her own pace, and she moved methodically from space to space, opening closets and checking window frames and running her hand along the countertops, and she asked practical questions about the age of the roof and the condition of the furnace and whether the appliances were included, and I answered everything honestly because I knew that transparency now would prevent problems later. After 30 minutes, she came back to the living room, and she said the house was exactly what she was looking for, and she asked me why I was selling so quickly, and I told her that I was relocating for work, which was not true, but was simpler than the real explanation, and she accepted it without pressing further because people in the middle of their own life disruptions rarely interrogate other people's stories. She asked me what I was asking for the property, and I named a price that was 15% below market value, and I saw her eyebrows rise slightly, and she asked if there was anything wrong with the house that I had not disclosed. And I said no, I just needed to close fast, and I was willing to trade price for speed. And she said she could do a cash offer and close in 7 days if I was serious. And I said I was, and she pulled out her phone and called her bank right there in the living room, and she confirmed that she could wire the funds by the end of the week, and then she looked at me and she said she would take it, and we shook hands, and I felt a small cold satisfaction, the kind you feel when a complicated plan clicks into place. I called Paul from the driveway, and I told him we had a deal, and he said he would prepare the purchase agreement and schedule the signing for the next morning, and I drove back to the hotel, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I updated my evidence ledger, September 25th, cash buyer secured, Irene Caldwell, nurse, divorced, closing scheduled for October 2nd, 7 days from agreement, and I added a note that the sale price was below market, but that the speed and certainty of the transaction justified the discount. I opened my laptop and I reviewed the property deed one more time, confirming that there were no errors, no encumbrances, no co-owners, and I printed a copy and I put it in a folder along with the original purchase documents and the title insurance policy, because I knew that once the sale went through, I would need to be able to prove to anyone who asked that the transaction was legal and properly executed. That evening, Lauren called me, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered, and she asked me how I was doing, and I said I was fine, just busy with work, and she asked when I was planning to come back to the house, and I said I was not sure yet, maybe in a few days, and she said she wanted to talk about logistics, about how we were going to handle the next few months, and I said we could talk about it soon, but that I was still figuring things out. And she said Kyle was asking when I was going to make a decision about the house, and I felt a spike of irritation that she was already acting as Kyle's messenger, but I kept my voice neutral and I said I was working on it. And she said she knew this was hard, but that they really needed to know soon because they had to make plans. And I said I understood, and I told her I would have an answer by the end of the week, and she sounded relieved, and she said thank you for being reasonable about this. And I did not correct her, I just said goodbye, and I ended the call. I realized that Lauren and Kyle had convinced themselves that I was going to cooperate, that my silence and my calm responses meant compliance rather than strategy, and I understood that this was my advantage, that they were so focused on their own narrative that they could not see what I was actually doing. I thought about calling my mother or one of my friends to tell them what was happening, but I decided against it, because the fewer people who knew about the sale before it closed, the less chance there was of someone accidentally mentioning it to Lauren or Kyle, and I needed them to remain confident and unsuspecting until the deed was transferred and the locks were changed. I ordered takeout from a restaurant down the street, and I ate in the hotel room while I reviewed the purchase agreement that Paul had emailed me, and I signed it electronically and I sent it back, and then I lay down on the bed and I set an alarm for 6 the next morning, because I had a closing to attend and a house to sell, and I wanted to make sure that everything went exactly according to plan. The next morning, I met Paul and Irene at the title company office, and the 3 of us sat around a conference table while Paul laid out the documents in neat stacks, the purchase agreement and the deed transfer and the settlement statement showing the wire transfer amount, and Irene reviewed each page carefully, asking questions about property taxes and homeowner association fees, and I answered everything precisely because I wanted this transaction to be as clean and unremarkable as possible. Paul explained that once we signed the documents and Irene's bank confirmed the wire transfer, the deed would be recorded with the county and the property would legally belong to Irene, and he said that typically this process took 30 days, but because we were doing a cash sale with no financing contingencies and no inspection period, we could close in 7 days, and Irene nodded and said she appreciated the speed because her current lease was ending and she needed to move in by the middle of the month. Irene asked me if there were any tenants or occupants in the property, and I said no, the house would be vacant as of the closing date, and she looked satisfied, and she signed the first page and then the second, and I watched her sign her name over and over, each signature transferring a piece of my history into her possession, and when it was my turn, I signed quickly and without hesitation, because I had already made peace with what I was doing, and I understood that this house had stopped being a home the moment Lauren told me she was carrying my brother's child. Paul collected the signed documents, and he made copies for each of us, and he said he would file the deed transfer with the county recorder that afternoon, and that once the wire transfer cleared, which would take 2 business days, the sale would be final and irreversible. And Irene shook my hand and thanked me for making the process so straightforward, and she said she was excited to move in and start her new chapter, and I told her I hoped she would be very happy there. I left the title company and I drove to a storage facility on the edge of town, one of those big metal buildings with rows of identical orange doors and keypads, and I rented a 10x10 unit, and I paid for 3 months in advance with a credit card, and the manager gave me a key and an access code, and I drove back to the house, and I parked in the driveway, and I walked through the rooms one last time, looking at the furniture and the photographs on the walls and the kitchen table where Lauren and I used to eat breakfast together before everything fell apart. I took my time deciding what to remove and what to leave, and I packed my clothes and my personal documents and my laptop and a few books, and I left everything else exactly where it was, the couch and the bed and the dishes and the television, because I wanted Lauren and Kyle to believe that I was still planning to come back, that I was just taking some essentials while I figured out my next move, and I knew that if the house still looked fully furnished and occupied, they would not suspect that I had already sold it. I made 3 trips to the storage unit, loading boxes into the back of my car and driving them across town and stacking them in the climate-controlled space. And by late afternoon, I had moved everything I cared about, and the house still looked lived in, still looked like a place where someone might return at any moment, and I locked the front door, and I drove back to the hotel, and I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, and I realized that I felt lighter than I had in weeks, as though I had been carrying a weight that I had finally set down. I updated my evidence ledger, September 26th, deed signed and filed, wire transfer pending, personal belongings moved to storage unit, house staged to appear occupied, and I added a note that Irene planned to change the locks on October 2nd, the same day the wire transfer would clear and the sale would become final. That evening, Kyle texted me asking if I had made a decision yet, and I replied that I was still working through the details, and he sent back a message saying that Lauren was getting anxious and that they really needed to know soon, and I said I understood and that I would have an answer by the end of the week, and he replied with a thumbs up emoji, and I could feel his impatience through the screen, his assumption that I was dragging my feet because I was emotional or indecisive, and I knew that he had no idea that the house he was planning to move into had already been sold, that the deed was already filed, that the countdown to his eviction had already started. I thought about telling him the truth right then, about sending him a copy of the signed deed and watching his reaction, but I decided to wait, because I knew that the impact would be so much greater if he and Lauren discovered it on their own, if they showed up at the house with their belongings and their plans and their certainty that I had given in, and they found the locks changed and a new owner standing in the doorway telling them they had no right to be there. Over the next several days, I maintained the illusion of indecision, responding to Lauren's texts with vague reassurances that I was thinking things through and needed a little more time, and she seemed to interpret my delays as emotional processing rather than strategic maneuvering, and she told me that she appreciated my willingness to consider their situation, and I let her believe that I was wrestling with guilt and family obligation when in reality, I was simply waiting for the wire transfer to clear and the deed to be recorded. On the morning of October 2nd, I received a call from Paul confirming that Irene's bank had completed the transfer, that the funds were in my account, and that the deed had been officially recorded with the county, which meant that as of 9:30 that morning, the house legally belonged to Irene Caldwell, and I thanked him, and I ended the call, and I sat in the hotel room staring at my phone, and I felt a strange sense of finality, as though I had just closed the door on an entire chapter of my life. I checked my bank account, and I saw the wire transfer listed there. A single line of text representing the sale of the home I had bought 7 years ago when I was 31 and optimistic about the future, and I transferred the money into a separate savings account that only I had access to, and I made a note in my evidence ledger documenting the exact time and amount of the transfer, because I knew that at some point Kyle might claim that I had stolen community property or hidden assets, and I wanted to be able to prove that the house had been mine alone and that the sale was legal and properly executed. I called Irene, and I congratulated her on the purchase, and I asked her when she planned to move in, and she said she had hired a locksmith for later that afternoon, and that she would be moving her furniture in over the weekend, and I asked her if she wanted me to leave the keys at the title company, and she said no, the locksmith would take care of everything. And I said that was fine, and I wished her well, and I hung up. I spent the rest of the day working on a routine property evaluation for a client, driving to a neighborhood I had never been to before and walking through a house that smelled like fresh paint and new carpet, and I took photographs and measurements, and I wrote up a report recommending a listing price, and the work felt grounding, a reminder that life continued in its practical details even when personal catastrophes were unfolding in the background. That evening, I received a text from Lauren asking if we could have dinner together to talk about the house situation, and I replied that I was still out of town for work, but that I would be back by the end of the week, which was a lie, but it bought me more time and kept her from showing up at the house before Irene had changed the locks. Lauren wrote back saying that Kyle was getting impatient, that he wanted to start moving his things in, and I replied that he should wait until we had a formal agreement in place, and she said okay, and I could sense her frustration, but I also knew that she was conflict-averse enough that she would not push too hard, and that she would convince Kyle to wait a few more days because she believed that patience would eventually get them what they wanted. I checked my email, and I saw a message from Irene with the subject line, "Locks Changed," and when I opened it, she had attached a photo of the new keys and a short note thanking me again for the smooth transaction, and she said she had posted an eviction notice on the front door as a precaution, even though I had told her the property was vacant, because her lawyer had advised her to follow proper procedure in case there were any squatters or unauthorized occupants. I looked at the photo of the eviction notice, a standard form printed on white paper and taped to the door, and it listed Irene as the legal owner and stated that any persons found on the property without permission would be subject to removal and possible prosecution for trespassing, and I saved the photo to my evidence ledger, and I realized that the trap was now fully set, that Lauren and Kyle could arrive at any moment and discover that the home they thought they were inheriting had been sold out from under them. I thought about driving over to the house to watch what happened, but I decided that it would be better to maintain distance, to let the situation unfold without my visible presence, because I did not want to give Kyle any opportunity to claim that I had orchestrated a confrontation or that I had acted out of malice rather than legal right. Instead, I drove to a coffee shop across the street from the house, a small place with large windows that face the front yard, and I ordered a black coffee, and I sat at a table near the window, and I opened my laptop, and I pretended to work while I kept one eye on the house. And I waited to see how long it would take for Lauren or Kyle to show up and try to use the keys that no longer worked in the locks that had been changed without their knowledge. I sat in the coffee shop for almost 3 hours, nursing 2 cups of coffee and occasionally typing on my laptop to maintain the appearance of working, and I watched the house across the street with the same patient focus I use when I'm waiting for a difficult negotiation to reach its breaking point. And at 4:15 in the afternoon, I saw Kyle's truck pull into the driveway, and my brother got out wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and he walked up to the front door carrying a cardboard box, and I watched him try to put his key in the lock, and I saw the moment when he realized that the key did not fit, and he tried it again, and then he stepped back and looked at the door, and he pulled out his phone and made a call. Kyle stood on the front porch talking on the phone for almost 5 minutes, and I assumed he was calling Lauren, and then he walked around to the side of the house and tried the side door, and that lock had been changed as well, and he came back to the front and he stood there staring at the eviction notice that Irene had posted, and I could see him reading it, and I could see the confusion and then the anger spreading across his face, and he took a photo of the notice with his phone, and then he tried calling someone else, and I knew without hearing the conversation that he was calling me, and I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and I ignored it, and I watched Kyle leave a voicemail, and then he tried the door one more time as though the lock might have magically changed back, and when it did not work, he walked back to his truck and sat in the driver's seat with the door open, and I could see him typing on his phone. 15 minutes later, Lauren's car pulled up behind Kyle's truck, and she got out quickly and walked up to the porch where Kyle was standing, and they talked for a moment, and then Lauren tried her own key, and it did not work either, and she read the eviction notice, and I saw her turn to Kyle and say something, and Kyle gestured at the notice and then at the door, and Lauren pulled out her phone, and I watched her dial, and my phone buzzed again, and I let it go to voicemail, and I could see Lauren's frustration even from across the street, the way she paced back and forth on the porch while she waited for me to answer, and when I did not, she lowered the phone, and she said something to Kyle, and he shook his head, and they both stood there looking at the door as though they could will it open through sheer determination. Lauren tried calling me again, and this time I picked up, and I said hello in a calm, neutral voice, and she said, "Where are you?" And I said I was working, and she said the locks on the house have been changed, and I said I know, and there was a long silence, and then she said, "What do you mean you know?" And I said exactly what it sounds like, the house has been sold, and she said, "Sold to who?" And I said, "To a woman named Irene Caldwell, a nurse who needed a place quickly," and Lauren said, "You sold our house." And I corrected her and said, "I sold my house, the one that was titled in my name alone," and she said, "You cannot do that," and I said, "Actually, I can," and I did, and the deed was recorded on October 2nd, which was this morning, and she said this morning, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice, and I said, "Yes, this morning," which means you and Kyle are currently standing on property that belongs to someone else. Lauren said we had an agreement, and I said we did not have an agreement. We had a conversation in which Kyle told me he wanted me to move out and sign over my equity, and I never agreed to any of that. And she said, "But you said you were thinking about it," and I said I was thinking about it, and I thought about it, and I decided to sell the house instead, and she said, "This is insane. You cannot just sell the house without telling us." And I said I absolutely can, and I did, and if you do not leave the property immediately, the new owner has the right to call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Lauren said, "I need to talk to you in person," and I said there is nothing to talk about. The house is sold, the transaction is final, you and Kyle need to find somewhere else to live. And she said, "What about the baby?" And I said, "There is no baby, Lauren. We both know the pregnancy test was fake." And she went silent. And I could hear Kyle in the background asking what I was saying, and Lauren said, "How did you know?" And I said, "Because I checked the bank account and there were no medical appointments, no OB/GYN visits, no prenatal vitamins, nothing that would indicate an actual pregnancy." And I said, "I also checked the packaging on the test, and it matches novelty tests sold online for pranks." Lauren did not respond, and I heard her breathing on the other end of the line, and then Kyle took the phone from her, and he said, "You are making a huge mistake." And I said, "No, Kyle. You made the mistake when you assumed I would just hand over my property because you asked nicely." And he said, "This is not over." And I said, "Actually, it is. The deed is recorded, the sale is final, and if you do not leave the property in the next 10 minutes, I will call the police myself and report you for trespassing." And Kyle said something I could not quite hear, and then the line went dead. I watched from the coffee shop window as Kyle handed the phone back to Lauren, and I could see them arguing on the front porch, their body language tense and angular. And Kyle gestured toward the eviction notice and then toward the street, and Lauren shook her head, and they stood there for another few minutes having what looked like a heated debate, and then Kyle walked back to his truck and got in, and Lauren followed him, and they sat in the truck together talking, and I assumed they were trying to figure out their next move, whether to leave or to wait or to try to force their way into a house that no longer belonged to me. I sipped my coffee, and I kept my face neutral, aware that if either of them looked across the street, they might see me sitting here, but neither of them seemed to notice the coffee shop or the people inside it. They were too focused on their own crisis, and I felt a cold satisfaction watching them realize that their plan had collapsed, that the narrative they had constructed about guilt and obligation and doing the right thing had run into the immovable reality of property law. After 10 minutes, a police car pulled into the driveway behind Lauren's car, and I realized that Irene must have been monitoring the property somehow, maybe through a doorbell camera, or maybe she had driven by and seen Kyle and Lauren on the porch, and she had called the police just as she said she would. An officer got out of the patrol car, a middle-aged man with a calm, professional demeanor, and he walked up to Kyle's truck and he spoke to them through the open window, and I could see Kyle gesturing and explaining, and the officer nodded and walked up to the porch and read the eviction notice, and then he came back to the truck and spoke to Kyle and Lauren again, and I saw Kyle get out of the truck and show the officer his key, the one that no longer worked, and the officer examined it and handed it back. And then he made a call on his radio, and a few minutes later a second patrol car arrived, and a younger officer got out and joined the first one. The two officers stood by Kyle's truck talking to him and Lauren for almost 15 minutes, and I could see Kyle becoming more animated, pointing at the house, and then at the eviction notice, and then pulling out his phone to show them something, probably a text message or a photo that he thought proved he had a right to be there. And the older officer took notes on a small pad, and then he walked back to his patrol car and made another call, and when he returned he spoke to Kyle and Lauren again, and I saw Lauren start to cry, and Kyle put his arm around her, and the officer said something else, and Kyle nodded, and they both got back into the truck, and the officers waited while Kyle backed out of the driveway, and Lauren followed in her car. And they drove away slowly, and the patrol cars followed them to the end of the block and then turned in a different direction. I sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, making sure that Kyle and Lauren were not going to come back, and then I paid for my coffee, and I walked outside, and I crossed the street, and I stood on the sidewalk in front of the house, and I looked at the eviction notice still taped to the door, and I took a photograph of it with my phone, making sure the date and the legal owner's name were clearly visible, and I added the photo to my evidence ledger with a note that read, October 2nd, 4:20 p.m., Kyle and Lauren attempted entry. Police removed them from property, no arrest, trespassing warning issued. I walked back to my car, and I drove to the hotel, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I played back the voicemails that Kyle and Lauren had left. And Kyle's message was angry and accusatory, calling me vindictive and selfish, and saying that I had destroyed any chance of reconciliation, and Lauren's message was quieter, almost pleading, asking me to reconsider, saying that they had nowhere to go, and I saved both voicemails and I uploaded them to my cloud storage, because I knew that at some point Kyle might try to claim that I had acted impulsively or maliciously, and I wanted to be able to show that I had given them no promises, no agreements, no reason to believe that the house was theirs. I ordered dinner from a restaurant down the street, and I ate in the hotel room while I reviewed the timeline of the last 10 days, from the moment I found the pregnancy test to the moment Kyle and Lauren were removed from the property by police, and I realized that everything had gone exactly according to plan, that I had sold the house without their knowledge, that I had let them believe they were moving in, and that I had watched them discover the truth in the most humiliating way possible, not through a conversation or a confrontation, but through a locked door and an eviction notice and a police escort off the property. I felt no guilt and no regret, only a quiet sense of completion, the same feeling I get when I close a difficult deal and all the paperwork is signed and filed and there is nothing left to do but move on to the next transaction. That evening, I received a text message from Lauren's mother, Rita, and the message said that Lauren had called her crying and saying that I had sold the house without warning and that she and Kyle had nowhere to go, and Rita asked me if this was true, and I replied, yes, it was true. I had sold the house that I owned, and Rita wrote back asking why I would do something so cruel. And I realized that Lauren had told her mother a version of the story that made me the villain, and left out the affair, and the fake pregnancy, and the plan to take my property. I called Rita directly, and when she answered, I could hear the tension in her voice. And she said that Lauren had told her I was being unreasonable and vindictive, and I said that was interesting because Lauren had not mentioned why I might be acting this way. And Rita said that Lauren told her we were having marital problems, but that they were working through it. And I asked Rita if Lauren had mentioned that she was having an affair with my brother Kyle. And there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I told Rita that Lauren had come to me 5 weeks ago and told me she was pregnant with Kyle's baby, and that she and Kyle wanted me to move out of my house and sign over my equity so they could raise the child there. And I said that I had later discovered that the pregnancy was fake, that the test Lauren showed me was a novelty item purchased online, and that there had been no doctor's appointments, no prenatal care, no medical evidence of any kind. And Rita said she did not believe me, and I said that was fine, but that I had documentation of everything, including photographs of the fake pregnancy test, bank statements showing no medical charges, and voice recordings of Kyle explaining why I should give them the house. Rita asked why Lauren would lie about being pregnant, and I said I assumed it was because she and Kyle thought that a baby would create enough guilt and family pressure that I would simply hand over the property. And Rita said that did not sound like something Lauren would do, and I said I understood that it was hard to accept, but that the evidence was clear, and I offered to send her copies of everything I had collected, and after a long pause she said yes, send it to me, and I hung up and I compiled a folder with the pregnancy test photos, the bank statements, the voice recording transcript, and the eviction notice, and I emailed it to her with a brief note explaining the timeline. The next morning, I received a call from Rita, and her voice was different, quieter and more strained, and she said she had reviewed the evidence and that she wanted to hear Lauren's side of the story before she made any judgments, but that she was deeply troubled by what she had seen, and she said that 3 months ago Lauren had asked her for $5,000 for fertility treatments, and I said that was interesting because there was no record of any fertility treatments in the bank account, and Rita said she had given Lauren the money in cash because Lauren said the clinic required upfront payment, and I said that now Rita knew where the money had actually gone, and Rita was silent for a moment, and then she said she needed to talk to Lauren, and I said that was between her and her daughter, but that I wanted Rita to know the truth because I suspected that Lauren was going to try to frame this as me abandoning her, when in reality I had simply protected my own property from people who were trying to steal it. Rita asked me if I was planning to file for divorce, and I said yes. I had already contacted a lawyer, and the paperwork would be filed by the end of the week, and she asked if there was any chance of reconciliation, and I said no, there was not. Because even if the pregnancy had been real, and even if Lauren had been genuinely remorseful, the fact that she and Kyle had planned to take my house showed a level of manipulation and entitlement that I could not overlook. Rita said she understood, and she apologized for not knowing what was happening. And she said that she had always thought Lauren and I had a solid marriage, and I said I had thought so too until I found the pregnancy test. And Rita said she was going to have a very difficult conversation with her daughter, and I thanked her for listening, and I ended the call, and I added a note to my evidence ledger documenting Rita's confirmation of the $5,000 loan and her acknowledgement that the money had been given under false pretenses. Over the next few days, I focused on practical matters, finding a new apartment and transferring my mail and updating my address with the bank and the DMV, and I avoided social media, and I did not respond to any messages from mutual friends who had started to hear rumors about the separation, because I knew that Kyle and Lauren would be trying to control the narrative, and I wanted to wait until the divorce paperwork was filed before I made any public statements. I met with a divorce attorney named Catherine Morales, a woman in her early 50s who specialized in high-asset cases, and I walked her through the timeline, and I showed her the evidence ledger, and she reviewed everything carefully, and she said that because the house had been purchased before the marriage and titled in my name alone, Lauren had no legal claim to it, and the sale was completely legitimate, and she said that Lauren might try to argue that I had sold the house out of spite, but that the evidence of the affair and the attempted property grab would make it very difficult for her to claim any kind of moral high ground. Catherine asked me if I wanted to pursue any kind of financial settlement or alimony, and I said no, I just wanted a clean separation with no ongoing obligations, and she said that was reasonable, and she drafted the divorce petition with a request for dissolution based on irreconcilable differences, and she included a detailed timeline of the affair and the fake pregnancy and the attempted property seizure, not because it would affect the legal outcome, but because it would create a record that Lauren could not easily dispute. I signed the petition, and Catherine filed it with the court, and she said that Lauren would be served with the papers within the next few days, and that once she was served, she would have 30 days to respond, and I said that was fine, and I left her office feeling a sense of momentum, as though I had finally moved from reaction to action, from defense to offense. 2 days later, I received a call from Kyle, and when I answered, he said that Lauren had been served with divorce papers and that she was devastated, and I said I was sorry to hear that, but it was the logical outcome of her choices. And Kyle said I was being vindictive and that I was punishing Lauren for something that was mostly his fault, and I asked him if he was taking responsibility for the affair, and he said yes, he was, but that did not mean I had to destroy Lauren's life, and I said I had not destroyed her life, I had simply refused to let her destroy mine, and Kyle said that the house sale was cruel and unnecessary, and I said the house sale was legal and strategic, and that if he and Lauren had not tried to manipulate me into giving up my property, then none of this would have happened. Kyle said that he had never meant for things to go this far, that he had thought we could work something out as a family, and I said we were not a family anymore. We were 3 people who had made choices that could not be undone, and Kyle said he wanted to make things right, and I asked him what that meant, and he said he did not know. Maybe he could pay me back for the house or something, and I said the house was sold, and the money was in my account, and there was nothing to pay back. And Kyle said he felt like I had ambushed them, and I said that was exactly what I had done, and that if he had expected me to announce my plans in advance, then he had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of. Kyle asked me if I was enjoying this, if I was getting some kind of satisfaction from watching them suffer, and I said I was not enjoying it, but I was not losing sleep over it either, because they had made a calculated decision to betray me and to try to steal my property, and they were now experiencing the consequences of that decision. And Kyle said I was cold, and I said I was realistic, and there was a difference, and Kyle said he hoped I would regret this someday, and I said I would not. And I hung up, and I blocked his number, because I knew that any further communication would just be more of the same, more blame and more justification and more attempts to reframe their betrayal as my overreaction. Over the following week, I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a newer building on the other side of town, a place with clean lines and large windows and no history, and I spent my evenings unpacking boxes and arranging furniture and trying to build a routine that did not include checking my phone every 10 minutes to see if Lauren or Kyle had sent another message trying to guilt me or threaten me or convince me that I had made a terrible mistake. I ignored most of the calls and texts from mutual friends who had heard various versions of what had happened, because I knew that anything I said would be filtered through their own biases and their own relationships with Lauren and Kyle, and I decided that the cleanest approach was to say nothing publicly and to let the legal process speak for itself, because divorce filings are public record and anyone who wanted to know the truth could read the petition and see the timeline laid out in clinical detail. On a Thursday afternoon, I received an email from Catherine Morales telling me that Lauren had filed a response to the divorce petition, and that her attorney was requesting a mediation session to discuss the division of assets. And I replied asking what assets there were to divide, given that the house had been my separate property and we had no joint accounts or shared investments. And Catherine said that Lauren's attorney was arguing that she had contributed to the household during the marriage and that she deserved some kind of compensation, and I said that was absurd. And Catherine said she agreed, but that we should attend the mediation anyway because it would look better to the judge if we had made a good faith effort to negotiate. I agreed to the mediation, and Catherine scheduled it for the following week at a neutral office downtown, and she told me to bring copies of all financial documents from the marriage, including bank statements and tax returns and any receipts for major purchases, and I said I would, and I spent the weekend organizing everything into a binder with tabs and labels because I wanted to be able to counter any claim Lauren made with immediate documentation. The mediation took place in a small conference room with beige walls and a table that was too large for the space, and Lauren sat on one side with her attorney, a young woman named Jessica Brennan, who wore a dark suit and had a brisk, efficient manner, and I sat on the other side with Catherine. And the mediator was a retired judge named Harold Stein, who explained that his role was to facilitate discussion and help us reach an agreement without going to trial. Jessica started by saying that Lauren had been blindsided by the house sale and that she felt she had been unfairly excluded from a major financial decision. And I said through Catherine that the house had been my separate property purchased before the marriage, and that I had no legal obligation to consult Lauren before selling it. And Jessica said that while that might be technically true, it showed a lack of good faith and a disregard for Lauren's emotional and financial well-being. And I said that Lauren had shown a lack of good faith when she had an affair with my brother and tried to manipulate me into giving up my property by faking a pregnancy. Jessica looked at Lauren, and Lauren looked down at the table, and Jessica said that the affair was a separate issue from the division of assets, and Catherine said no, it was not a separate issue, because the affair and the fake pregnancy and the attempted property seizure were all part of a coordinated effort to take my house, and that Lauren had no grounds to claim any kind of financial hardship when she had been actively plotting to steal my most valuable asset. Jessica said that was a harsh characterization, and Catherine slid a copy of the evidence ledger across the table, and Jessica spent several minutes reviewing it, and I watched her face change as she read the timeline, the pregnancy test photos, the bank statements, the voice recording transcript, and the eviction notice. And when she finished, she looked at Lauren and said, "We need to talk privately," and the mediator called a recess, and Lauren and Jessica left the room. Catherine and I sat in silence for a few minutes, and then she said that Jessica had clearly not been given the full story by her client, and that once she reviewed the evidence, she would probably advise Lauren to accept a simple dissolution with no financial claims, and I said I hoped so because I did not want to spend the next 6 months in court fighting over assets that did not exist. The mediator came back into the room and said that Lauren and her attorney needed more time to confer and that we should reconvene in an hour, and Catherine and I left the building and walked to a nearby cafe. And we sat outside in the cold October air drinking coffee, and Catherine said that cases like this were always harder when there were family dynamics involved, because the emotional betrayal made it difficult for people to think clearly about the legal realities. And I said I was thinking very clearly, and she smiled and said yes, I had noticed, and that was probably why Lauren was having such a hard time, because she had expected me to be emotional and reactive, and instead I had been methodical and strategic, and now she was facing the consequences of underestimating me. When we returned to the mediation room, Lauren's eyes were red, and her face was blotchy, and Jessica said that after reviewing the evidence, she was advising her client to accept a dissolution with no financial claims and no spousal support, and that Lauren would keep her personal belongings and her car and her retirement account, and I would keep the proceeds from the house sale and my retirement account, and we would have no ongoing financial obligations to each other. And Catherine said that was acceptable, and the mediator drafted a settlement agreement, and we all signed it, and the mediation was over in less than 20 minutes. Lauren did not look at me during the signing, and when we stood up to leave, she walked out quickly without saying anything, and Jessica followed her, and I watched them disappear down the hallway, and I felt a quiet sense of relief that this part of the process was finished, that we had reached an agreement without a trial, and that in a few months the divorce would be final and I would be legally free of a marriage that had been built on a foundation I had not fully understood until it collapsed. As I was leaving the building, I saw Kyle waiting in the lobby, and he stood up when he saw me, and he said he wanted to talk, and I said there was nothing to talk about, and he said he needed to explain something, and I stopped and I looked at him, and I said, "You have 5 minutes." And he said that the pregnancy had been Lauren's idea, not his, that she had come to him and told him that she wanted to leave me, but she was afraid I would make it difficult, and that she thought if she told me she was pregnant with his baby, then I would be so disgusted that I would just leave and give her the house. And I asked him if he expected me to believe that, and he said it was the truth, that he had gone along with it because he thought it would help Lauren get out of a marriage she was unhappy in. And I said, "So, you are telling me that you had an affair with my wife as a favor to her?" And he said it was not like that. It was complicated, and I said it was not complicated, it was simple. You wanted my house, and you thought you could guilt me into giving it to you. Kyle said that was not true, that he had never wanted the house, that he just wanted to help Lauren, and I said, "Then, why did you tell me that I should move out and sign over my equity?" And he said because Lauren told him that was what I would want, that I would want to do the right thing for the baby, and I said there was no baby Kyle, there was never a baby, it was a scam from the beginning, and Kyle said he did not know it was fake, that Lauren told him she was pregnant and he believed her, and I said you are lying, you knew it was fake, you had to know, because if you really thought there was a baby, you would have been asking about doctor's appointments and ultrasounds and all the things that actual expectant fathers ask about, but you never mentioned any of that, you just talked about the house and the equity, and when I was going to move out. Kyle was silent for a moment, and then he said he had made a mistake, that he should have been honest with me from the beginning, and I said, "Yes, you should have, but you were not. And now you are trying to rewrite history to make yourself look like a victim instead of a co-conspirator." And Kyle said he was not trying to rewrite anything, he just wanted me to know that it was not all his idea, and I said I do not care whose idea it was. You both executed it, you both lied to me, you both tried to steal my property, and you are both dealing with the consequences. Kyle asked me if I was ever going to forgive him, and I said no, I was not, because forgiveness requires remorse and change, and I did not see any evidence of either, and Kyle said he was sorry, and I said sorry is just a word. It does not undo what you did, and it does not mean I have to let you back into my life, and Kyle said we are brothers, and I said we were brothers, past tense, and that relationship ended the moment you decided to sleep with my wife and try to take my house. Kyle said I was being unreasonable, and I said I was being consistent, and there was a difference, and I walked past him and out of the building, and I got into my car, and I drove back to my apartment. And I did not look back, because I knew that if I gave Kyle any indication that I was willing to negotiate or reconcile, then he would interpret it as weakness. And I had spent too much time building a life based on discipline and planning to let him think that he could talk his way back into my trust. That evening, I received a call from Rita, and she said that she had spoken to Lauren and that Lauren had admitted that the pregnancy was fake, and that she had staged it because she thought it was the only way to get me to agree to a separation without a fight, and Rita said she was ashamed of her daughter and that she had told Lauren she would not be giving her any more financial support until Lauren took responsibility for what she had done. I thanked Rita for calling, and I said I appreciated her honesty, and Rita said she wanted me to know that she did not condone what Lauren had done, and that she thought I had handled the situation with more grace than Lauren deserved, and I said I had not been trying to be graceful. I had just been trying to protect myself, and Rita said that was fair, and she wished me well, and she said she hoped I would find someone who appreciated me, and I said I was not thinking about that right now. I was just focused on rebuilding my life, and Rita said that was smart, and we ended the call, and I sat in my apartment looking out at the city lights, and I realized that for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not happy exactly, but calm, as though the storm had finally passed and I could see clearly again. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later on a gray morning in late November, and I drove to the courthouse alone, and I sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom watching other couples arrive with their attorneys, some of them looking angry, and some of them looking relieved, and some of them looking like they had already moved on emotionally and were just there to complete the paperwork. When my case was called, I walked into the courtroom with Catherine, and Lauren was already seated at the other table with Jessica, and the judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and a no-nonsense expression, and she reviewed the settlement agreement and asked if both parties understood and agreed to the terms. And we both said yes, and she signed the dissolution order and said that the marriage was officially ended and that we were free to go, and the entire proceeding took less than 10 minutes. And I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter, as though I had been carrying something heavy for months and had finally been allowed to set it down. I did not speak to Lauren as we left the courthouse, and I did not look back to see if she was watching me leave, because I had already said everything I needed to say during the mediation, and there was no point in prolonging the interaction or giving her another opportunity to try to reframe what had happened. I drove back to my apartment, and I changed into running clothes, and I went for a long run through the park near my building, and the cold air burned my lungs and my legs ached, but I kept running because I needed to move. I needed to feel my body doing something physical and purposeful. And by the time I got back to my apartment, I was exhausted and clear-headed, and I took a long shower, and I made myself dinner, and I sat at my small kitchen table eating pasta and drinking water, and I opened my laptop, and I looked at my evidence ledger one last time, scrolling through the entries from the pregnancy test photo to the divorce decree, and then I closed the file and I moved it to an archive folder, because I did not need to look at it anymore. It had served its purpose, and now it was just a record of something that was finished. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine that felt sustainable, working during the day and running in the evenings and reading at night, and I avoided social situations where I might run into Lauren or Kyle or anyone who wanted to ask me questions about what had happened, because I had no interest in relitigating the past or defending my decisions to people who had not been there and did not have access to the full story. I received a few messages from mutual friends expressing sympathy or curiosity, and I replied politely but briefly, thanking them for their concern but making it clear that I was moving forward and did not want to dwell on the details, and most of them respected that, and the ones who did not, I stopped responding to. In early December, I received a text message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, I saw that it was from Kyle, sent from a new phone, and the message said that he had been evicted from his apartment for non-payment of rent, and that he was staying with a friend but that he needed help, and he asked if I could loan him some money to get back on his feet, and I stared at the message for a long moment, and then I took a screenshot of it, and I saved it to a folder on my phone labeled Closed, and I blocked the number without replying, because I knew that any response would be interpreted as an opening, as a signal that I was willing to engage or negotiate, and I was not. I thought about forwarding the screenshot to Rita so that she would know that Kyle was still trying to manipulate people into bailing him out of situations he had created for himself, but I decided against it, because Rita had her own relationship with Lauren and her own decisions to make, and I did not need to insert myself into their family dynamics any more than I already had. Later that week, I was at a coffee shop near my office reviewing contracts for a client when I saw Irene Caldwell walk in, and she recognized me and came over to my table, and she asked how I was doing, and I said I was doing well, and she said she wanted to thank me again for the smooth transaction, and that she loved the house, and that she had repainted the living room and planted some bulbs in the front yard. And I said I was glad to hear it, and she asked if I had found a new place, and I said yes, I had an apartment across town, and she said she hoped I was settling in, and I said I was, and then she paused, and she said she wanted me to know that a few weeks after she moved in, a man and a woman had come to the door claiming they had a right to be there, and that they had tried to convince her that there had been some kind of mistake with the sale. And I asked her what she had done, and she said she had shown them the deed and told them to leave, and when they refused, she had called the police again, and they had been escorted off the property a second time, and I thanked her for telling me, and she said she just wanted me to know, in case they tried to contact me or cause any trouble, and I said I appreciated the information, and she smiled and said she hoped things were looking up for me, and I said they were. And she went to the counter to order her coffee, and I went back to my contracts. That evening, I sat in my apartment, and I thought about the fact that Kyle and Lauren had gone back to the house even after they had been removed by police, even after they had been served with divorce papers and signed a settlement agreement. And I realized that they were still operating under the assumption that if they pushed hard enough, or complained loud enough, or made me feel guilty enough, then I would eventually give in and give them what they wanted. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and how I made decisions. Because I was not someone who acted out of emotion or guilt or social pressure, I was someone who acted out of logic and evidence and long-term strategy. And once I had decided on a course of action, I did not second-guess it or reverse it just because someone else was unhappy with the outcome. I opened my laptop and I checked my bank account, and I saw the balance from the house sale sitting there, untouched except for the security deposit and first month's rent on the apartment, and I thought about what I wanted to do with the money, whether I wanted to buy another property or invest it or just leave it in savings as a cushion, and I decided that I did not need to make that decision right now, that it was okay to take my time and think carefully about the next step, because I had spent so much energy over the past few months protecting what I had built that I had not had time to think about what I wanted to build next. In mid-December, I received a call from Catherine telling me that Lauren's attorney had contacted her asking if I would be willing to meet with Lauren one more time to discuss some unresolved emotional issues, and I said no, I would not, because there were no unresolved issues. Everything had been settled in the mediation and finalized in the divorce decree, and Catherine said she had told Jessica the same thing, but that Jessica had insisted on asking, and I said I appreciated Catherine checking with me, but that my answer was final, and Catherine said she understood, and she said that the case was officially closed on her end, and that I should not hesitate to contact her if anything else came up, and I thanked her and ended the call, and I made a note in my personal files that the divorce was complete, and that there were no outstanding legal matters. On Christmas Eve, I drove to my parents' house for dinner, the first time I had seen them since the separation, and when I walked in, my mother hugged me tightly and said she was glad I was there, and my father shook my hand and asked how I was holding up, and I said I was fine, and my mother said she had heard from Rita about what had happened and that she was sorry I had gone through all of that. And I said it was over now, and my father said he had always liked Lauren, but that what she and Kyle had done was unforgivable. And I said I agreed, and my mother asked if I had heard from Kyle, and I said no, and I did not expect to. And my father said that Kyle had called him a few weeks ago asking for money, and that he had refused, and that he had told Kyle that he needed to take responsibility for his own choices. And I said I appreciated that. And my father said he wanted me to know that he and my mother supported me completely, and that they did not expect me to reconcile with Kyle just because they were family. And I said thank you, and my mother started to cry, and my father put his arm around her, and I stood there feeling awkward and grateful at the same time, because I knew that my parents were struggling with the fact that their two sons were no longer speaking, but I also knew that they understood why, and that they were not going to pressure me to forgive someone who had betrayed me. We had dinner together, and we talked about work and the weather and my parents' plans to visit my aunt in Florida in the spring, and we did not mention Lauren or Kyle again, and when I left that evening, my mother hugged me again and told me to take care of myself, and I said I would, and I drove back to my apartment feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief, because I realized that this was what closure felt like, not a dramatic confrontation or a final conversation, but just the quiet recognition that something was over and that I could move forward without looking back. I walked into my apartment, and I poured myself a glass of water, and I stood at the window looking out at the city, and I thought about the fact that a year ago I had been married and living in a house with a woman I thought I knew, and now I was divorced and living in an apartment alone, and my brother was estranged and my wife was gone, and everything I had thought was stable had turned out to be temporary. But I was still here, still working, still planning, still building a life that was based on my own choices and my own values, and that felt like enough. The next morning, I woke up early and I went for a run, and when I got back, I made coffee and I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I opened a new document and I started making a list of goals for the next year, places I wanted to travel, skills I wanted to learn, projects I wanted to complete, and I realized that for the first time in months, I was thinking about the future instead of the past, and that felt like progress. And I saved the document and I closed my laptop, and I looked around my small apartment with its clean surfaces and its absence of history. And I thought about the fact that I had lost a house and a marriage and a brother, but I had kept my integrity and my discipline and my ability to see clearly, and that in the end those were the things that mattered most, because houses could be sold and relationships could end, but the way you conducted yourself, the way you documented the truth and stood by your decisions even when they were difficult, that was something that no one could take from you, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had done exactly that, and that I could live with the consequences and that I was ready for whatever came next.